Okay. We're going to very quickly just kind of go over some equipment stuff. Not a whole lot because most of the time our PA system's already set up for the most part. But some typical things you'll see in every sound system, you'll have a console, which is the technical term for the soundboard. You'll have cables, various types of cabling for instruments, snakes, other things. Speakers and monitors, whether they be active speakers or passive speakers. Active speakers mean that they have power built into them. So if you notice these have blue lights on them, they're active speakers. So they have the power amp built in. All you have to do is plug up a power cable and then your audio cable, and you're ready to go. The speakers that we usually have in here are passive, which means they require a power amp, which we have in a closet in the back room. But those power amps amplify the signal to be projected through the speaker system. And then you have microphones, and there's other things such as, drums and whatnot. But this is from a audio setup. This is typically what you'll see. Speaker placement. We talked about phasing earlier. Ideally, you want to place speakers that maximize their coverage area. So you don't want to have a whole lot of overlap, but you don't want to have no overlap. And you want to cover as much of the room as possible with as few speakers as possible to get your desired volume. So sometimes you'll have to put like 3 or 4 speakers stacked together to get to the right volume you need. If you're in a big, huge arena, you'll see these big, huge stacks of speakers that they put together. The more speakers you put together, they go, 3, 6, 10, something like that. That's how much they double in volume. 3 decibels, 6 decibels, so on and so forth. But the ultimate goal is that every seat in this room, or wherever you're at, no matter where you sit, sounds the exact same. In practice, you can never achieve that, but that's the goal. You want to have, no matter where you're sitting, to be the exact same sound everywhere. The biggest mistake, which is what I've done here, but that's mostly because I couldn't hear them from sitting here, and where we mix later, kind of need to be able to hear it from here. The biggest mistake is to point the speakers at the same spot, because that's where you get into phasing issues. We talked about that earlier. So if you have a speaker here and a speaker here with a coverage area like this, first of all, if you're sitting anywhere in here, it's going to sound very dead. You're basically hearing the reflections of the room come back to you. But right here, you're going to have all sorts of phasing issues. You're going to have spots where it's going to sound really dead, and you're going to have spots where it's going to sound really big and over the top. These speakers, again, have 120-degree throw distance, which means 3 speakers are covering the same area almost all the time, which if you go from spot to spot, you'll hear the sound go in and out as you walk around. So ideally, what you want is you want 2 speakers here with their lines. So if you have a coverage area like this, you want a coverage area like that with 2 speakers, one facing that way and one facing that way. That's ideally where you're going to have no phasing issues whatsoever. But the only way to do that is to put a center stack speaker here, which doesn't really work out well for being able to hear everything from the front of the room to the back of the room and sides and everything like that. Or if you don't have the ability to put them in the ceiling, you have to put the speakers right in the middle of the band, and I don't think the band would like that too much. Or the people there to see the band. So typically you'll have a left and a right speaker, and you want them set up so they cover as much of the room as possible with as little phasing as possible. That's the idea behind speaker placement. Excuse me. You'll also see some floor monitors from time to time. These are really great because they're pretty cheap compared to in-ear monitor systems, unless you are building one from scratch and you have a lot of floor monitors you need. But typically if you have just one floor monitor for every person in the band, it's going to be cheaper than buying in-ears, a way to route signal to those in-ears. If you do wireless for in-ears, it's typically cheaper to do floor monitors. Really great if you have someone just sitting here and they're never going to move around, and you don't have to worry about feedback or stage volume. If you start moving around the stage, if you move away from your monitor, you're not going to be able to hear yourself. So that's one of the cons. They do take up some space. They require power amps, so those are some negatives as well. But you do see them a lot. In fact, most churches still use actual floor monitors. In-ears are becoming more and more common. So, again, the last point, anything that the band hears, you will hear a little bit of a spill into the room. So your main PA system has to make up for the monitor volume. So when we had floor monitors here, our PA system had to be either really loud or it sounded really bad because all you're listening to was the floor monitors. So again, the floor monitors are facing that way. The audience is this way. That's not a good thing. Anyways, those are floor monitors. The in-ears are becoming more and more common, especially here. We have in-ears here in this room, Mount Carmel. I think the youth are the only people who don't have in-ears. So sad for them. So again, some of the pros. There's no stage volume to worry about. So whatever volume you hear in the room is either the acoustic volume of whatever it is they're playing, such as drums, or your PA system. That's all you hear in the room, which is really good for having controlled sound. Typically with in-ears, you can do a left and a right, so you can have things in your left ear, things in your right ear, which helps if you want to have a click track going in one ear and everything else going in your other ear, so you can keep time better. So you can also set, okay, I want all the band in this ear and my instrument in this ear, or however you want to do it. It's fine. It's up to you guys, or up to the band. But there's different ways of doing it. No way is a wrong way, but you can stereo pan left to right. Some of the cons, again, they are a little bit more expensive, especially when you start talking about wireless in-ears. A single wireless transmitter that is of good quality will run you at least $600 for one. That does not include the actual earbuds. I just bought a pair of earbuds that cost me $1,000. So they can get pretty expensive pretty quick.
Why?
Because I did. I wanted 6 drivers.
Oh.
I wanted 6 drivers for my head. I didn't want these single drivers. I wanted to have 6 speakers blasting noise into my head. No. I should have gone with less, but whatever. So, happy birthday to me. The biggest con that you hear all the time with anyone who uses an in-ear monitor for the first time is that it sounds like they are closed off from the world. You can't really hear what the audience is doing. So if the audience, if you are really big about audience participation and want to be able to hear them sing, or if you want to hear somebody like shout out from back here, hallelujah, if you want to be able to hear that, the in-ear monitors probably aren't going to be a good thing for you unless you do room mics, which room mics are incredibly hard to do properly. We have some in here, but they're not really great. So you do feel like you are closed off from the rest of the world. But that's the band's problem, not yours. I'm just kidding. In addition to in-ear monitors is where you get to the idea of personal mixing, which is what those P16s are on the stage. You basically send them a series of channels. They can choose which channel they want, and they can control the volume and left, right. They actually have some EQ controls if they want to change the EQ of that channel for themselves. Typically, you only see this with in-ear solutions. Every once in a while, you'll see somebody using one of those for like a floor monitor if they want to control their own floor monitor. So yeah.
Chris,
Yeah.
just wondering, typically with all technologies, new technologies, they get cheaper and better all the time. Is it you seeing a trend in this?
Yeah, absolutely. 5 years ago, having an in-ear system here would probably be out of the question. Well, probably more like 10 years ago. And every year there's new stuff that comes out that's even cheaper and you have more features and yeah. So this board right here, we bought it, 4 years ago, I think?
I don't think it was that long.
3 years ago? Was that like 3 or 4 years ago? It's been here for about 3 at least. They don't make this board anymore.
Did he really?
It's obsolete.
It was obsolete when you bought it.
Well, this is a very entry-level board to begin with. I mean, this is a $2,000 soundboard, and you can get digital consoles upwards of $50,000, $75,000 if you want them to. But they have computer-based ones where you run everything off a computer now. You don't even need this if you don't want this. So yeah, it's getting cheaper all the time and more features, and yeah. You're always going to have a cost to wireless just because of the nature of wireless and radio transmissions, and it's just always going to have a cost associated to it. It's not as much as it used to be, but it's not going to come down quite as fast. So one of the things with personal mixing is that typically with a big, huge band, you're not going to be able to send every channel you have on your board to each individual channel for the band, which is where we group things. So like we group a drum mix. We group things such as the pastor mic, the computer control, the extra handheld mic. We group all that into a single channel. So we do use groups to send to the band as a single channel that they can mix. But most of the time we can get away with a lot. We can send almost everything as individual channels to the band. Of course, if we have a big, huge band on stage, that's not always the case. But for our typical Sunday, yeah, we can send everything but the drums as individual channels. So that kind of covers personal mixers. Next, we're going to talk about some types of microphones. There's 2 different types. There's a dynamic and a condenser microphone. A condenser microphone is designed to pick up a whole lot. They're usually a little more expensive. The condensers inside of them are a little more fragile, but they pick up a whole lot more around them. But as such, they're more prone to being damaged. They're more prone to picking up things that they don't necessarily want to pick up. Condenser microphone is a great vocal microphone, unless you're on a live stage, and then it picks up everything in the room. So usually you'll have dynamic microphones for that because they don't pick up quite as much. They're a little bit more rugged, so if you drop them more often than not, you won't necessarily damage them. You might dent them. Every once in a while you might break them, but they'll hold up better than a condenser mic will. So one of the things I wanted to show you about microphones is a pickup pattern. And this is really important for people who have trouble singing into a microphone the right way. So if this is the top of the microphone, this is the pickup inside the microphone, so there's like a little casing around it. If this is the microphone, and if this up here is where, so if this is your microphone, it's pointing straight, so this is your straight point. On a typical vocal microphone, your pickup pattern is going to look something like this. Okay? So if you drew a perfect circle around here, it's going to look more like this. So this is like a 360-degree arc around the microphone. So this is a typical pickup pattern for a microphone. So if you're holding the microphone like this, if it's pointing straight at your face, that's great. As soon as you start doing this, you start losing part of the strength of the microphone. So anyone who has the microphone that's pointed straight up and you're talking this way, you're not picking up a whole lot of anything, which is where you start cranking the gain, and that's where you start getting a whole lot of feedback. So anyone who has the microphone held down here, typically more often than not, that's where you start hearing feedback, and that's where it sounds really thin. If you have the microphone right in front of your face, that's the optimal best spot for me as a sound guy for you to hold your microphone. Now if you notice, all this down here is dead space. This is what's called a null point. Okay, anything back this way is null, which means the microphone won't pick up any of that. This is really important when you start talking about drum mics and also vocal microphones. So if you point the vocal microphone so that the null point of the microphone is facing the room, it's going to pick up less of the room. So if you have someone who points the microphone like this all the time, you're going to start picking up more of the room. But if you do this, it's going to pick up less of the room. Make sense? Same thing with the drum mic. If you have a snare drum sitting right here, and if you put this mic point here, but your cymbals are over here, you're going to pick up a lot of that cymbal. So So what you do is you take this microphone, you just move it over here. You get less of the cymbal, more of the drum. So you can do those kind of things. So if you're listening to a drum for some reason, it's like, man, all I'm hearing is just this guy wailing on this cymbal. I don't even hear the drum hardly at all. Move the microphone, and you can fix that. Make sense? So speaking of drum mics and the pickup pattern, we just talked about that. So we did all that. Typically, when you're talking about drum mics, that's the most heavily mic'd instrument we have. And that's typical for almost anything. You'll have more inputs for your drums than any other group of channels on your board. Most often you'll have a kick drum, a snare drum, however many toms you have, you'll have a mic for each of your toms, 2 overhead mics. I'm not going to get into the science of why 2 overhead mics, but basically you always want to have like a stereo pair just for recording purposes and for the idea of like, oh, if you hit something on the left side of your drum, it sounds like it's coming out the left ear if you're using a stereo mix in your heads. We don't use stereo, but we still want to capture the entire drum kit. So if you put a mic dead center, it's going to capture everything in the middle, but everything on the cymbals on the outside won't sound very well. So we want to capture these cymbals and these cymbals. That's the basic idea behind 2 overheads. More often than not, you're going to see a lot of people doing 2 mics on snare drums and 2 mics on kick drums. The reason behind 2 mics on snare drum, you want the crack of the top head, but you want the rattle of the bottom head. If you put the mic on the top, you lose a lot of the rattle that snare drum typically gives you. So that's the reason you put a mic on the top and a mic on the bottom. But again, you introduce phasing issues. So you'll want to make sure that you use the phasing button on your board to flip one of the microphones out of phase. So that way it sounds nice and full again. Same thing with kick drums. Usually have one for the inside to get the initial hit of the kick, so it sounds like an actual kick drum, but you want one that captures all the air that comes out of the hole of the kick drum, all the woof, the low end, the thump. So that way you can get a nice deep kick drum as well. If you only have one, typically you put it right on the inside of the rim of the kick drum, which is what we do here. On guitar amps, typically you'll have an SM57. That's just the industry standard for the most part. I mean, you can use anything you want, but more often you'll want to have a dynamic microphone on it because we're going to be on a very loud stage. If you have a way to isolate the amp in like an amp room or build a box around the amp, you can use a condenser microphone so it sounds a little warmer. But typically a dynamic SM57 is what you're going to use, what you're going to see. So same thing with basically the microphones. Where you have the microphone for the... This is going to fall over. Because it requires extra cabling and it kind of blocks the path. If anyone ever needed to get back there for like the baptism for whatever reason, which on a given Sunday might happen, we don't want to block people from getting back there, especially if they're getting out of the baptism and they're wet. We don't want water dripping on a nice, big, huge 100-watt powered
Well,
amp.
they're baptized now, so at least you know where they're going to go.
This is true.
You'd have a few volunteers, though.
Okay,
I've already been
so inside of every guitar amp is a speaker, and the cone of the speaker is like this. Right here is the center of the speaker. This is the brightest part of that speaker. This is the darkest part of the speaker. That's actually going to be what I said. So if you have a mic that's put right here, it's going to sound very harsh. It's not going to sound very pleasant. So typically what you want is you want to find this edge right here, which if you take a flashlight and shine it right at the mesh, you can usually see it, or you can just feel it. You basically want to start your microphone here, point it right there, and if it's too dark and you don't have enough brightness to it, you start moving it in until you get to the actual sound you want. And that's how you mic a guitar amp. Sometimes, instead of pointing it straight at the speaker, you can kind of point at an angle to kind of kill some of the attack a little bit, depending on which way you face it, obviously. I always find pointing it straight at it, putting it right up against the mesh head, and finding a good spot somewhere around in here is usually the best place to put it.
And then put a marker on it to say, hey, this is the sweet spot.
Typically, you'll see people put tape around the spot where you're supposed to mic it, yeah. You never want to put tape covering the spot where you're mic'd, but like if this is where you mic'd it right here, say this is where you mic'd it, you'll see tape like that.
I was thinking just a marker.
I mean, you could, but usually most amps are black. The meshes are black. They do.
Yeah, Chris. Yeah, Chris.
Talk. Yeah. Not at all. But if you're on a dark stage, it's usually easier just to see the tape, feel the tape, than it is to look for a marker. Either way works. But anyway, so like I said in the slide, 1/2 inch makes a world of difference in the tone you capture from a guitar amp. So if it doesn't sound right on a soundboard, but the amp sounds good, chances are your microphone's in the wrong spot. Okay? So, well, if the amp sounds good, the guitar is okay. So, the other thing you'll see is direct inputs, which are your direct boxes. Basically, anything that's not XLR captured microphone. Don't need to worry too much about high impedance. That basically just means you can only send the signal so far before it degrades. But basically what a direct box does is it takes a high impedance signal and converts it over to a low impedance signal so you can send it 100, 200 feet, however long you need to send it to. Typically a high impedance signal, you can only go about 20 feet before you start getting signal degradation. So computers are direct inputs. Anything going through a direct box is considered a direct input. It's basically a 1/4 inch out of the keyboards, 1/4 inch out of the bass guitar. Those are all direct inputs. And lastly, in the equipment stuff will be wireless. More and more stuff is going wireless these days. The big thing you need to worry about is your RF signal interference. Everything is operating on radio frequency waves. So if you have a lot of stuff, you need to make sure that it is separated so they're not talking on the same frequencies. If you have like 10 microphones, for example, most manufacturers have groups. So you basically just pick which group you want and then which channel you want, and that basically just makes sure that that microphone will not talk to any other microphone in that same group or channel. That's basically the easiest way to do it. Every once in a while, you'll hear something cut out. Usually means that something in the room was stronger than the microphone was getting to the receiver. Or the antenna's going bad, and it just doesn't have enough signal strength to send to you, or batteries are going out. And that's basically equipment. Those are your essentials. Any questions about any of that?
How about double miking amps?
Can be done.
Like, how would it be executed?
And why?
And why?
Okay, so to double mic an amp, it's basically the same concept of having a dry and a bright and a dark, or if you want to have two separate amps and you ran stereo out. Most people here only run one amp, mostly because we don't have room to put two amps on the stage. Secondly, most people don't have two amps. But usually dual miking is when you're doing stereo amps, where you have one amp that's set up one way, one amp that's set up a different way, and you want to capture a different sound for both of them. So you want one that's really bright, but you want one that's really dark, and then you can balance the two of them in the sound board. The other way to do it, if you're using one amp, is to basically set one up really bright, one up really dark, and then you can do the same thing. It's a little bit extra work for someone who doesn't do sound full time. So if you're talking about volunteer, it's usually easier just to do one mic and just run at that. Yeah, so. Now in a studio, you always double mic stuff, but that's just because you have a condenser mic and a dynamic mic usually. Any other questions? All right. So now we're going to get into